The first frost of November had come early that year. It clung to the dead weeds in thin white crystals, glittering under the first gray light of dawn like something almost beautiful. The vacant field at the corner of Outer Drive and Jefferson Avenue sat forgotten between a boarded-up gas station and a chain-link fence that had long since rusted through. This was the edge of Detroit in 1979, a place where the city bled into the river towns, where factory smokestacks painted the sky in shades of industrial gray, and where nobody came unless they had a reason to hide something. On the morning of November 6, 1979, a patrol officer found a body. The first officer on the scene was a 24-year-old patrolman named David Kowalski. He would later tell investigators that he smelled it before he saw it, that particular stillness in the air that meant something had died. He pushed through the brittle brush, frost crunching beneath his boots, and found her lying face down in a shallow depression, partially covered by dead leaves and a piece of discarded cardboard. She was young. That was the first thing he noticed. Young and small, her dark hair tangled with dirt and debris, her bare legs pale against the frozen earth. She wore a simple blouse torn at the collar. One shoe was missing. Her hands were curled into fists, even in death, the hands of someone who had fought. Her name was Diane Marie Holloway. She was 21 years old. She had been raped, beaten, and strangled sometime in the hours before midnight. And she had been 3 months pregnant with her second child. Less than 2 miles away, in a small rental house on 15th Street in Ecorse, her 6-month-old son Mickey had cried alone in his crib for hours, waiting for a mother who would never come home. For 40 years her killer walked free. He lived his life. He watched his grandchildren grow up. He slept soundly in his bed while Diane's mother grew old, waiting for answers that never came. This is the story of Diane Holloway, and the woman who refused to let the world forget her. If you believe that justice has no expiration date, subscribe now, because this channel proves that no case is ever truly cold. To understand what was lost on November 5, 1979, you have to understand who Diane Holloway was before that night erased her future. She was born Diane Marie Ogilvy on March 23, 1958, in the small working-class city of Wyandotte, Michigan. Wyandotte sits just south of Detroit along the western bank of the Detroit River, a place where the water catches the light in the early morning, and the air always carries a faint trace of industry, steel and smoke and honest work. It was a town of modest brick homes with chain-link fences and concrete stoops where fathers worked the factories and mothers hung laundry on backyard lines, where kids played kickball in the street until the streetlights flickered on, and someone's mom leaned out the screen door hollering that dinner was ready. Diane was the second of 4 children born to Richard and Patricia Ogilvy. Everyone called her mother Pat. The Ogilvy house sat on a corner lot where the maple tree dropped helicopters every fall and the neighborhood kids gathered on summer evenings to catch fireflies in mason jars. Diane was the kind of girl who laughed too loud and too often, whose joy was so infectious that people remembered it decades later. She had dark hair that she liked to curl, bright eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, and a voice that could carry a Motown tune across the backyard. She loved Motown, the Temptations, the Supremes, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, the sounds that drifted from every screen door and car radio in southeast Michigan during the 60s and 70s. Diane knew all the words. She would dance in the kitchen while her mother cooked, spinning across the linoleum with a dish towel as a microphone, belting out, "My girl," or "Stop," in the name of love, until her siblings begged her to stop and her father pretended to cover his ears. But she never really stopped. That was Diane, too full of life to contain. From the time she was a little girl, Diane dreamed of being a mother. She would wrap her baby dolls in dish towels and push them around in a toy stroller, feeding them imaginary bottles and singing them to sleep. When she was 12, she started babysitting for the neighbors, and she was so good with children that families on the block requested her by name. She had a gift for making kids feel safe, for turning the ordinary moments of childhood into something warm and magical. She wanted that for herself someday. A home, a husband, a house full of children and laughter and music. It wasn't a complicated dream. It was the dream of 1,000 girls in 1,000 small towns across America. The dream of a life built on love and ordinary happiness. In the spring of 1978, that dream began to take shape. His name was Michael Holloway, and he was 22 years old when Diane met him. A young factory worker at Great Lakes Steel with calloused hands and a shy smile. Mike wasn't flashy. He didn't have much money or big plans. But he was steady, dependable, the kind of man who showed up when he said he would and meant the words he spoke. He looked at Diane like she was the only person in the room. They married on June 24, 1978, in a small ceremony at the Catholic Church on Oak Street. Diane wore a white dress her mother had sewn by hand. In every photograph from that day, she's grinning so wide you can almost hear her laughing. 9 months later, on St. Patrick's Day, 1979, she gave birth to their first child, Michael Richard Holloway II. Everyone called him Mickey. The young family moved into a small rental house at 3972 15th Street in Ecorse, a blue-collar river town neighboring Wyandotte. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a postage stamp yard. To Diane, it was everything. Money was tight. Mike worked long shifts at the factory, sometimes doubles, coming home exhausted and smelling of steel and sweat. Diane stayed home with the baby, stretching every dollar, clipping coupons, learning to make meals out of almost nothing. But there was joy in that house. Anyone who visited could feel it. Diane sang to Mickey while she did the dishes, making up little songs about soap bubbles and sunshine. She danced with him in the kitchen the same way she had danced alone as a girl, spinning across the linoleum while Motown played on the radio. She was the kind of mother who curled her hair and put on lipstick even when she was just running to the corner store for milk. Not because she was vain, but because she believed that every day deserved a little bit of effort, a little bit of beauty. She wanted Mickey to grow up knowing that life was worth showing up for. By the fall of 1979, Diane was pregnant again, 3 months along, still early enough that only close family knew. She was already imagining it. Mickey as a big brother, a second crib in the small bedroom, 2 little faces at the breakfast table. She talked about names with Mike during his rare evenings off. She started setting aside the baby clothes that Mickey had outgrown, washing them and folding them into a drawer for the child who would come in the spring. She was 21 years old. She had a 6-month-old son who adored her, a husband who came home to her every night, a baby growing inside her, and a whole life stretching out ahead of her like a road with no end. She had no way of knowing that road was about to end on a frozen Monday night in November. She had no way of knowing that in less than 8 weeks she would be dead, and her killer would walk free for the next 4 decades. But before we get to that night, you need to understand something. Diane Holloway was not a statistic. She was not a case number or a headline or a name on a cold case file. She was a daughter, a wife, a mother. She was a woman who laughed too loud and loved Motown and dreamed of ordinary happiness. She was someone who mattered, and she deserved so much more time than she got. November 5th, 1979 was a Monday. There was nothing remarkable about it. The sky over Ecorse was the color of wet cement, the kind of gray that settles over southeastern Michigan in late autumn and doesn't lift until April. The leaves had already fallen from the maples and oaks that lined 15th Street, and they lay in sodden brown heaps along the curbs, waiting for the rain to wash them into the storm drains. The air smelled of wood smoke and the faint chemical tang that drifted up from the factories along the river. At 3972 15th Street, Diane Holloway moved through her ordinary Monday routine. She fed Mickey his breakfast, mashed bananas and cereal, the kind that came in a box with a cartoon character on the front. She changed his diaper, dressed him in a soft blue onesie, and set him in his playpen while she tidied the kitchen. The radio was on, tuned to the local station that played a mix of news, weather, and the Motown hits she loved. Outside the window, she could see the neighbor's dog nosing through the dead leaves in the yard next door. Mike had left for work early that morning. He was pulling the afternoon shift at Great Lakes Steel, 3 o'clock to 11, which meant he wouldn't be home until nearly midnight. Diane was used to the long hours alone. She had developed her own rhythm. Naps when Mickey napped, laundry in the afternoon, dinner for herself around 6, then the quiet evening hours when she would watch television with the baby on her lap until it was time to put him down for the night. By late afternoon, the gray sky had darkened to charcoal. The streetlights on 15th Street flickered on around 5 o'clock, casting pale yellow pools on the wet pavement. Diane drew the curtains against the early darkness and turned on the lamp in the living room. The television glowed in the corner, some game show, then the evening news, then whatever came on after. Mickey was fussy that evening, teething probably. Diane walked him around the small living room, bouncing him gently, singing softly under her breath. She gave him a cold washcloth to chew on, and eventually he settled. By 7 o'clock he was drowsy. She carried him to the nursery, laid him in his crib, and wound up the mobile that hung above it. Little plastic stars and moons that played a tinny lullaby when they spun. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him drift off. The house was quiet now. Just the low murmur of the television in the other room and the occasional car passing on the street outside. Diane Holloway had no way of knowing that she had less than 4 hours left to live. What happened next exists only in fragments. The evidence left behind, the timeline reconstructed by detectives, the terrible gaps that 40 years of investigation could never fill. Sometime between 7:30 and 11 p.m., someone came to the house on 15th Street. We don't know if Diane knew him. We don't know if she opened the door willingly or if he forced his way in. We don't know if she had time to scream or if the attack was so sudden and so brutal that she never had the chance. What we know is this: it happened fast, and Diane fought back with everything she had. The evidence told that story. Defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, the marks left when someone raises their arms to block a blow. Bruises on her wrists and ankles, the kind that come from being restrained. Torn fingernails, a clump of hair pulled from her scalp. She did not go quietly, she did not surrender. But in the end, it wasn't enough. He raped her, he beat her. And then he wrapped something around her throat, a ligature, the medical examiner would later note, something thin and strong. And he strangled her until she stopped breathing. She was 3 months pregnant, and in the nursery down the hall, her 6-month-old son slept through it all, unaware that his mother was dying in the next room. At 11:30 p.m., Mike Holloway pulled into the driveway at 3972 15th Street. His shift had run a little late, some equipment issue on the floor that needed sorting before the night crew took over. He was tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from 8 hours of physical labor in a steel mill. His shoulders ached, his hands smelled of metal and machine oil. All he wanted was to kiss his wife, check on the baby, and fall into bed. The first thing he noticed was the side door. It was unlocked, not just unlocked, slightly ajar, the way it might be if someone had left in a hurry and hadn't pulled it all the way closed. Mike frowned. Diane was careful about locking up, especially when she was home alone with Mickey. She had grown up in a neighborhood where people looked out for each other, but she wasn't naive. She knew the world could be dangerous. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The television was still on. The blue-white flicker of the screen cast shifting shadows across the living room walls. Some late-night program, Johnny Carson maybe, or a movie. The sound was low, just a murmur of voices and canned laughter. "Diane?" No answer. Mike walked through the kitchen. The dishes from dinner were in the sink, not washed. That was unusual. Diane liked to clean up before she settled in for the evening. A half-empty glass of water sat on the counter, a faint ring of condensation beneath it. "Diane? I'm home." Still nothing, just the television and the hollow silence of a house that should have had someone in it. And then he heard Mickey. The baby was crying. Not the urgent wail of hunger or pain, but the exhausted, hiccuping sobs of an infant who had been crying for a long time and had nearly given up. Mike's stomach dropped. He moved quickly now down the short hallway to the nursery and found his son red-faced and trembling in the crib, his tiny fists clenched, tears streaking his cheeks. Mike picked him up, held him close, felt the baby's shuddering breaths against his chest. Mickey was wet, his diaper soaked through. How long had he been lying there, crying for his mother in the dark? "Diane!" Mike carried the baby through the house, calling her name, checking every room. The bathroom was empty. The bedroom was empty. The closet doors were open, her clothes hanging undisturbed. Her purse was on the kitchen counter, right where she always left it. Her cigarettes were there too. She never went anywhere without her cigarettes. The diaper bag sat by the front door, packed and ready for errands she would never run. And then he saw it. On the living room carpet near the edge of the couch there was a small spot of blood. Not much, maybe the size of a quarter. It had soaked into the fibers and dried to a dark rust color. Beside it, glinting in the television's flickering light, lay a single earring. Diane's earring, the small gold hoops she wore every day. Mike Holloway stood in his living room holding his crying son, staring at that spot of blood, and felt the world collapse around him. She didn't leave. She was taken. The 911 call came in at 11:47 p.m. The dispatcher who answered would later describe Mike Holloway's voice as shattered, a man trying to form coherent sentences while his entire world fell apart. He kept saying the same things over and over. "My wife is gone. There's blood. My baby was alone. Please, you have to help me, please." Ecorse Police Department patrol units arrived within 8 minutes. They found Mike on the front porch, still holding Mickey, unable to go back inside. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the baby. A female neighbor had come over and was trying to take the infant from him, but Mike wouldn't let go. He just kept saying, "Where is she? Where did she go?" Within the hour, the small house on 15th Street was swarming with officers. Detectives examined the blood spot and the earring. They photographed the unlocked door, the abandoned purse, the television still murmuring in the empty room. They walked the perimeter of the property with flashlights, checking the yard, the alley, the neighboring lots. Diane was nowhere. The search expanded through the night. Patrol cars cruised the surrounding blocks, spotlights sweeping across vacant lots and alleyways. Officers knocked on doors, waking neighbors who had heard nothing and seen nothing. A K-9 unit was requested from Detroit, but by the time it arrived, the scent trail had gone cold. At 5:47 a.m., just as the first gray light began to seep into the eastern sky, a patrol officer named David Kowalski found her. The vacant field at Outer Drive and Jefferson Avenue was less than 2 miles from 15th Street. It sat at the edge of Detroit, a forgotten triangle of weeds and trash between a boarded-up gas station and a rusted chain-link fence. Nobody came here. Nobody paid attention to what might be hidden in the dead grass. Diane's body lay face down in a shallow depression, partially covered with dead leaves and a piece of cardboard. She was cold to the touch. Rigor mortis had already begun to set in. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been killed sometime between 8 hours and 10:30 p.m., hours before Mike came home, hours while Mickey cried alone in his crib. She had been raped. She had been beaten. She had been strangled with a thin ligature that left deep furrows in the skin of her throat. And she had been pregnant, 3 months along. The child she was carrying, the baby she had already started planning for, already started dreaming about, died with her. Semen was recovered from her body and from her clothing. The samples were collected, labeled, and sent to the Wayne County Medical Examiner's office. In 1979, DNA testing did not exist. There was nothing anyone could do with those samples except store them and hope that someday, somehow, science would catch up. Someone at the medical examiner's office made a decision that night. Instead of discarding the biological evidence, they preserved it. They placed the swabs in the freezer, logged them into the evidence system, and sealed them away. That decision would take 40 years to matter. But in November 1979, it meant nothing. Diane Holloway was dead, her killer was free, and the only evidence that could identify him was locked in a freezer, silent and useless, waiting for a future that hadn't been invented yet. The murder of Diane Holloway was the most brutal crime Ecorse had ever seen. Ecorse in 1979 was a small city, barely 11,000 people, most of them connected to the steel mills and auto plants along the Detroit River. The police department had never handled anything like this. Within 48 hours, detectives had conducted over 60 interviews. Neighbors, friends, registered sex offenders. Everyone had an alibi. Everyone had seen nothing. Mike Holloway was the first person they focused on. This was standard. In cases of violence against women, the husband is always the primary suspect until cleared. Mike cooperated fully. He provided time clock records from Great Lakes Steel, passed a polygraph, and allowed detectives to search everything he owned. Within 2 weeks, he was officially cleared. The man who lost his wife was not the man who killed her. The investigation turned outward. Detectives collected blood samples from a half-dozen persons of interest, hoping blood typing might narrow the field. But the semen found on Diane's body came from a type O secretor, matching roughly 45% of the population. Blood typing told them almost nothing. Tips poured in: a suspicious car, a scream someone thought was kids playing, a vague description of a man in a dark jacket. Every lead went nowhere. By 1985, the case file was moved to a cardboard box in the evidence storage room. Someone wrote, "Holloway Diane, Homicide, 1179" on the side in black marker, and slid it onto a shelf alongside other unsolved cases, other families still waiting. The box gathered dust, but the biological evidence, the swabs from Diane's body, remained frozen in the medical examiner's office. The technology to analyze them did not exist. The killer's DNA was locked in those tubes, silent and waiting, but no one in 1985 could hear what it had to say. Diane Holloway became a name on a shelf, but her mother refused to let her become a forgotten one. Patricia Ogilvy was 51 years old when she buried her daughter. She had spent the first half-century of her life building the ordinary things that matter most: a marriage, a home, 4 children who grew up healthy and strong. She had weathered hard times the way working-class women in the Midwest always did, with grit, with faith, with the quiet assumption that if you kept your head down and did the right thing, life would eventually be fair. She went to church on Sundays, volunteered at the school bake sales, and kept a spotless house even when money was tight. She believed in God, in family, and the basic goodness of the world. On November 6, 1979, that belief shattered. The knock came just after 7 in the morning. Pat was in the kitchen making coffee, listening to the radio murmur the morning news. Richard had already left for work. The kids were scattered. Two grown and moved out, one still in high school, one married with a baby of her own. That one was Diane. Pat opened the door and saw two police officers standing on her porch. One of them was holding his hat in his hands, turning it over and over by the brim. She knew before they said a word. A mother knows. "Mrs. Ogilvy, may we come inside?" She doesn't remember what they said after that. She remembers fragments, words that seem to float in the air without meaning. "Found this morning. Vacant field. We're so sorry." She remembers the younger officer reaching out to steady her as her knees buckled. She remembers the sound of her own voice, a keening wail that didn't sound human, that couldn't possibly be coming from her own throat. She remembers falling. The floor came up to meet her, hard and cold, and she lay there on the linoleum of her own kitchen, curled into herself like a child, screaming her daughter's name. The officers didn't know what to do. They stood there helpless, these men trained to handle violence and crisis, completely undone by a mother's grief. From that moment forward, Pat Ogilvy's life divided into two parts: before and after. Before was a lifetime of ordinary happiness. After was something else entirely, a half-life, a shadow existence, a daily act of survival that required more strength than she ever knew she had. In the weeks following Diane's murder, Pat moved through the world like a ghost. She attended the funeral, though she would later have no memory of it. She stood at the graveside, watched the casket lower into the frozen Michigan earth, and felt something inside her turn to stone. Richard held her arm, keeping her upright. Mickey, only 6 months old, was in someone else's arms. She couldn't remember whose. The baby was crying. Babies cry at funerals. They don't understand what's happening, only that the adults around them are wrong. That something in the air tastes like grief. Pat wore a small gold cross necklace that day. She had worn it to Diane's baptism, to her first communion, to her wedding. Now she wore it to her funeral. She would never take it off again. For the next 42 years, that cross hung against her chest, a talisman of faith and memory, a physical connection to the daughter she had lost. After the funeral, people brought casseroles. They came to the house with Pyrex dishes covered in aluminum foil, with cards that said, "With sympathy," in flowing script, with awkward embraces and murmured words that meant nothing. "She's in a better place. God has a plan. Time heals all wounds." Pat nodded and thanked them and put the casseroles in the refrigerator, where they sat untouched until Richard threw them away weeks later. Time heals all wounds, that's what they said. They were wrong. The first year was the hardest. Pat couldn't sleep. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of Diane's life in her mind. The day she was born, red-faced and screaming, so small she fit in the crook of Pat's arm. Her first steps across the kitchen floor, wobbling like a drunk sailor, laughing when she fell. The Halloween costumes Pat had sewn by hand, a princess, a cat, a bumblebee with wire wings that kept getting bent. The school plays and birthday parties and summer afternoons at the lake. The wedding day, Diane in white, glowing so beautiful it made Pat's heart ache. And then, the other memories, the ones she couldn't stop, the ones that came unbidden in the dark hours before dawn. What had Diane felt in those final moments? Had she been afraid? Had she called out for her mother? Had she suffered? Pat would never know the answers. That was the cruelest part. The not knowing. The questions that would never be answered, that would circle endlessly in her mind like vultures over carrion. She lost weight, 15 pounds in the first month, then another 10. Her clothes hung loose on her frame. Her hair, once dark like Diane's, began to turn gray. She looked in the mirror and saw an old woman staring back. Someone she didn't recognize, someone hollowed out by grief. Richard begged her to see a doctor. She refused. What could a doctor do? Prescribe pills to make her forget? She didn't want to forget. Forgetting would be a betrayal. As long as she remembered, Diane was still alive somewhere. In her mind, in her heart, in the shrine she built on the mantel. The shrine began simply. Diane's senior portrait, the one taken just before graduation. She's smiling in the photograph, her dark hair feathered back in the style of the late 70s, her eyes bright with the confidence of youth. Behind her is that mottled blue background that every school photographer used, cheap and generic, but Diane's smile makes it look like something more. Pat placed the photograph on the mantel, propped against a small vase that had belonged to her own mother. She added a candle beside it, a white pillar candle that she lit every evening at sunset. Then came other things. Diane's rosary from her first communion, a lock of her baby hair preserved in a small envelope, a dried flower from her wedding bouquet pressed flat and fragile as paper. The shrine grew over the years, newspaper clippings about the case, letters from other families who had lost children to violence, photographs of Mickey as he grew, birthdays, school pictures, Little League games. Pat wanted Diane to see her son growing up. She talked to the photograph sometimes late at night when the house was quiet. "Look at him, baby. He's getting so big he has your smile." Every holiday, Pat drove to the cemetery. She brought flowers, red roses in summer, white lilies at Easter, poinsettias at Christmas. She cleared away the dead leaves and the debris that accumulated on the grave, kept the headstone clean, made sure the grass was trimmed. She knelt in the wet earth and talked to her daughter as if she could hear. 40 years, she never missed a single holiday. Rain or shine, illness or health, she made that drive. Nothing could stop her. Nothing would ever stop her. The vigil began on the first anniversary of Diane's death, November 6, 1980. A cold, gray evening, the sky spitting rain that couldn't decide if it wanted to be snow. Pat stood outside the Ecorse police station holding a single candle and a photograph of Diane. She had made a sign out of poster board and marker. "Justice for Diane Holloway. We will not forget." She stood there for 3 hours, alone, while the rain soaked through her coat and the wind threatened to blow out her candle. Passing cars slowed to look. A few people stopped to ask what she was doing. She told them. She told everyone. The next year, a few others joined her. Diane's siblings. Some neighbors from Wyandotte who remembered the little girl with the infectious laugh. A reporter from the local paper who wrote a small article that ran on page 6. The year after that, more people came, and more the year after that. By the mid-1980s, the annual vigil had become a tradition. Every November 6th, no matter the weather, Pat Ogilvy stood outside the police station with her candle and her sign. Sometimes a dozen people joined her, sometimes only a handful. But she was always there, the constant at the center of it all. A 5'2" woman with gray hair and fierce eyes who refused to let the world forget. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Because this story isn't just about Michigan. It's about every mother who ever refused to give up. Pat founded the Diane Ogilvy Holloway Foundation in 1984. It started small, a post office box, a checking account with a few $100s, a handful of volunteers who helped stuff envelopes. The mission was simple: raise awareness about violence against women, support families of cold case victims, and push law enforcement to never give up on unsolved murders. She spoke at community centers, at church groups, at high school assemblies. She told Diane's story over and over, her voice steady even when her heart was breaking. She wanted people to see Diane as a person, not a statistic. She wanted them to understand that every cold case file represented a family still waiting, still hoping, still refusing to accept that justice might never come. The foundation grew. By the 1990s, it had raised tens of thousands of dollars for victim advocacy programs. Pat testified before the Michigan State Legislature, urging them to fund cold case units and preserve biological evidence from old crimes. She wrote letters to every new attorney general, every new governor, every new police chief who took over an E-course. The letters always said the same thing. Please don't forget my daughter. The years became decades. The world changed. Pat didn't. Every November 6th, she stood outside the police station. Her hair went from gray to white. Her posture stooped. She needed a cane in her 70s, a walker in her 80s, but she was there. Always there. Holding the candle, holding the photograph. Holding the hope that someday, somehow, the man who killed her daughter would face justice. Detectives changed. Chiefs retired. Evidence clerks came and went. Every new person who opened the Holloway case file heard the same plea from Pat Ogilvy. She called the department regularly, sometimes monthly, sometimes weekly. She showed up at the station with newspaper clippings about DNA breakthroughs in other states, California, Virginia, Colorado. Cases that had been cold for decades, suddenly solved by science that hadn't existed when the crimes were committed. If they can do it there, why not here? If they can solve those cases, why not Diane's? The detectives were patient with her, most of them, anyway. They understood her grief, even if they couldn't give her what she wanted. They explained that the evidence had been preserved, that the DNA profile was in the system, that they were waiting for a match. They didn't have the heart to tell her that waiting might mean forever. But Pat already knew that. She had made her peace with the possibility that she might die without seeing justice. She had decided it didn't matter. She would fight anyway. She would keep showing up, keep making calls, keep holding vigils until her last breath. Because giving up would mean admitting that Diane's death didn't matter. And that was something she would never, ever do. Mickey Holloway grew up without his mother. He was raised first by Mike, then increasingly by his grandparents as Mike struggled with his own grief and the demands of single fatherhood. Pat and Richard took Mickey on weekends, then for whole summers, then eventually full-time. They gave him the stability that his shattered father couldn't always provide. Pat made sure Mickey knew who his mother was. She showed him the photographs, told him the stories, kept Diane's memory alive in the house where she herself had grown up. She took him to the cemetery on holidays, taught him how to place flowers on the grave, helped him write little letters to the mother he would never remember. Mickey grew into a teenager, then a young man, then a husband and father himself. He had Diane's smile, everyone said, the same infectious laugh. He carried his mother inside him, even though he had no memories of her voice or her arms around him, and he carried the weight of her unsolved murder. The knowledge that somewhere out there her killer was living free. Pat saw it in his eyes sometimes, that flash of anger and helplessness. She understood it because she felt it too. "We'll find him, baby. Someday we'll find him." She had been saying it for 40 years. In 2017, a new detective opened the box. His name was Ryan Lally, a sergeant with the E-course Police Department who had transferred in from Detroit a few years earlier. He was in his early 40s, young enough to still believe in the possibility of justice, old enough to know how rare it actually was. He had a reputation for thoroughness, for refusing to accept "we tried everything" as an answer, for looking at cold cases not as dead ends but as puzzles waiting to be solved. The Holloway case landed on his desk almost by accident. He was reorganizing the evidence room, cataloging old files, when he pulled out the cardboard box with Diane's name written on the side in faded black marker. The box was dusty, the cardboard soft with age. Inside were the original case files, the interview transcripts, the photographs, the lab reports, and a note indicating that biological evidence was still preserved at the Wayne County Medical Examiner's office. Lally read through the file from beginning to end. It took him 2 days. When he finished, he sat at his desk for a long time staring at Diane's photograph, 21 years old, a mother, pregnant with her second child. Taken from her home on an ordinary Monday night and murdered by someone who had never been identified. The file was full of dead ends, but Lally noticed something that the original detectives couldn't have known in 1979. The biological evidence had never been fully exploited. The DNA profile had been entered into CODIS twice, in 2001 and again in 2008, but both times there was no match. The killer wasn't in the system. He had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA collection. But genetic genealogy was changing everything. Lally had been following the Golden State Killer case, which had broken wide open in April 2018 when investigators used genealogy databases to identify Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer who had terrorized California in the 1970s and 1980s. The technique was revolutionary. Upload a DNA profile to a public genealogy site like GEDmatch, find distant relatives who had voluntarily submitted their DNA, and build a family tree backward until you identified the source. If it worked for the Golden State Killer, why not for Diane Holloway? The problem was the evidence. 40 years in a freezer had taken its toll. The original samples were small to begin with, and biological material degrades over time, even when properly stored. The DNA that remained was fragmentary, incomplete, enough for a partial profile but not enough for the kind of robust analysis that CODIS required. Lally needed a specialist. He found one at a private laboratory in Virginia that specialized in touch DNA and degraded samples. The lab had developed new techniques for extracting genetic material from evidence that other labs had given up on. They had helped solve cases in a dozen states, pulling usable DNA from decades-old clothing, from bones that had been buried for years, from evidence that everyone assumed was too far gone to matter. Lally sent them the remaining swabs from Diane's body. It was a gamble. If the extraction failed, there might not be enough material for a second attempt. 40 years of preservation would mean nothing if the final analysis came back inconclusive. He waited. Weeks passed, then months. Lally found himself checking his email compulsively, looking for the notification from Virginia. He didn't tell Pat Ogilvy about the new effort. He couldn't bear to raise her hopes if it didn't work out. She was 81 years old now. She had been waiting for 40 years. Another disappointment might break her. In December 2018, the results came back. The lab had managed to rebuild a partial DNA profile, not complete but sufficient for genetic genealogy. 22 markers, enough to identify familial connections with reasonable confidence. It wasn't a perfect match, but it was a map, and maps could lead somewhere. Lally made the call to a genetic genealogist named Dr. Julie Macklin. Dr. Macklin was one of the pioneers in the field, a former academic who had spent the past decade building family trees for law enforcement agencies across the country. She had worked on some of the highest-profile cold cases of the era, cases where traditional investigation had failed and only DNA could break through. She took Diane Holloway's profile and uploaded it to GEDmatch in early January 2019. The results came back within weeks. The unknown male DNA had matches, distant relatives, third and fourth cousins, people who had submitted their own genetic material to genealogy sites in hopes of tracing their ancestry. None of them were the killer, but each one was a branch on a family tree that could be traced backward, generation by generation, until it reached a common ancestor. Macklin worked methodically, building the tree from the outside in. She identified the killer's great-great-grandparents, then their children, then their grandchildren. She cross-referenced census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries. She eliminated branches where the descendants were female or too young or too old, or living too far from Michigan in 1979. Slowly, the tree narrowed. By March 2019, Macklin had identified a single family living in the Downriver area of Michigan, the cluster of blue-collar cities south of Detroit that included Ecorse, Wyandotte, Lincoln Park, and a dozen other tight-knit communities. The family had deep roots in the area, going back generations. They were factory workers, tradesmen, the kind of people who stayed in one place their whole lives. At the top of the suspect list was a man named Raymond Lee Richmond. Ray Richmond was 78 years old in 2019. He had been 58 on the night Diane Holloway was murdered, old enough to be her father, old enough to know better, old enough to understand exactly what he was doing when he took her from her home and ended her life. In 1979, Richmond lived on a quiet street less than half a mile from 15th Street. He was a factory worker like most men in Ecorse. He had a wife, children, a house with a chain-link fence and a patch of lawn he mowed every Saturday. He was a regular at the VFW Hall on Friday nights, a volunteer Little League coach who taught neighborhood kids how to grip a bat. He went to church on Easter and Christmas, nodded politely to his neighbors, kept his nose out of other people's business. He was invisible, the kind of man no one ever noticed. Lally found the detail buried in the original case file, a list of attendees that a detective had compiled in the days after the murder, hoping that the killer might show his face at the service. Hundreds of names, most of them family and friends, a few of them neighbors who barely knew Diane but came to pay their respects. Raymond Richmond was on the list. He had stood at the back of the church, watched Pat Ogilvy weep over her daughter's casket, and walked out into the November cold without saying a word. For 40 years he had lived in plain sight. He had raised his children, retired from the factory, become a grandfather. He had watched Pat Ogilvy march past his street every November 6th, holding her candle and her photograph, demanding justice for her daughter. He had seen the newspaper articles about the case, the anniversary coverage, the pleas for information. And he had said nothing, done nothing, gone about his life as if Diane Holloway had never existed. The final piece of evidence came from a McDonald's parking lot. In May 2019, detectives followed Raymond Richmond to a fast food restaurant in Lincoln Park. They watched him order coffee at the drive-through window, watched him sit in his car in the parking lot, watched him finish the coffee and toss the empty cup into a trash can before driving away. The moment his car was out of sight, an officer retrieved the cup. The DNA on the rim was a perfect match to the DNA recovered from Diane Holloway's body 40 years earlier. 22 markers. No possibility of error. The man who had raped and murdered a 21-year-old mother in 1979 had just thrown his confession into a fast food trash can. Sergeant Lally stared at the lab report for a long time. Raymond Richmond. The name meant nothing to most people, but Lally had seen it in the original case file, on the list of funeral attendees from November 1979. The killer had stood in the church. He had watched Pat Ogilvy weep over her daughter's casket, and then he had walked out into the cold and lived another 40 years as if nothing had happened. For 4 decades, Richmond had followed the same routine: coffee at McDonald's every Tuesday and Thursday, lunch at the VFW on Fridays. He played cards with the same group of retirees, told the same stories about his years at the factory, complained about his knees and the weather. He was a creature of habit, invisible, unremarkable, forgettable. The kind of man who faded into the background of every room he entered. And every November 6th, when Pat Ogilvy marched past his street holding a candle, he stayed inside and watched through the curtains. Lally picked up the phone. He called Pat first, then he called Mickey. "Mrs. Ogilvy, I need you to come down to the station. There's something I have to tell you in person. Pat Ogilvy had received phone calls from the Ecorse Police Department before. Dozens of them over the years, new detectives, follow-up questions, apologies. It was always nothing. But something in Ryan Lally's voice was different. Mrs. Ogilvy, I need you to come down to the station. There's something I have to tell you in person. In 4 decades, no detective had ever asked her to come in. Pat was 81 years old. Her hands shook as she set down the receiver. She called her son to drive her. The 15-minute drive felt like hours. Sergeant Lally met her in the lobby. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had seen too much and learned to hide it. But his eyes were different that day. There was something in them that Pat hadn't seen in a detective's eyes since the very first days after Diane's murder. Before the leads dried up, before the case went cold, before hope became a burden rather than a comfort. He led her to a conference room. There was a table, a few chairs, a box of tissues that someone had thoughtfully placed within reach. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Pat sat down heavily, her hands folded in her lap, her gold cross necklace resting against her chest. Lally sat across from her. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Mrs. Ogilvy, we have identified the man who killed Diane. The words didn't register at first. They floated in the air like something from a dream, too impossible to be real. Pat stared at him, waiting for the qualification. We think, we believe, we are not sure yet. But Lally just looked at her with those steady eyes, and she understood that he wasn't guessing. Who? The word came out as a whisper. Lally told her. Raymond Lee Richmond, a neighbor. A man who lived less than half a mile from 15th Street. A man who had attended Diane's funeral. Pat's hand went to her mouth. She made a sound, not a word, not a scream, something in between. A sound that 40 years of waiting had been building toward. We have DNA evidence, Lally continued. It's a perfect match. There's no doubt, Mrs. Ogilvy, we know who did this. Pat began to cry. Not the quiet tears she had learned to shed in private, but deep, racking sobs that shook her whole body. 40 years. 40 years of candles and vigils and letters and phone calls. 40 years of not knowing, of imagining every face on the street, of wondering if she had ever passed her daughter's killer without knowing it. She had passed him. She had marched past his street every November 6th, holding Diane's picture, and he had been there, watching, saying nothing. The arrest warrant was signed on June 12, 2019. The next morning, just after 7 a.m., a team of officers from the Ecorse Police Department and the Wayne County Sheriff's Office assembled outside a small house on Secott Street. The house was unremarkable. White siding, a concrete stoop, a chain-link fence enclosing a patchy lawn. An American flag hung limply from a bracket beside the front door. A late-model sedan sat in the driveway, its windows still wet with morning dew. Inside that house, Raymond Lee Richmond was finishing his breakfast. He was 78 years old, a retiree with thinning white hair and a face that sagged with age. He had grandchildren. He had a routine. He had spent the past 40 years believing that he had gotten away with murder. The knock on the door came at 7:14 a.m. Richmond answered in his bathrobe. He saw the uniforms, the badges, the grim faces of men who knew exactly what he had done. For a moment something flickered behind his eyes, recognition perhaps, or the sudden understanding that the past had finally caught up with him. Raymond Lee Richmond? Yes. You're under arrest for the murder of Diane Marie Holloway. They handcuffed him in his own doorway in front of the house where he had lived for decades, on the street where he had raised his children and celebrated holidays and pretended to be a normal man. His wife stood in the hallway behind him, her face white with shock. Neighbors peered through curtains drawn by the flashing lights of the police cruisers. 40 years and 7 months after he had strangled a pregnant 21-year-old mother and left her body in a vacant field, Raymond Richmond was finally in custody. He denied everything at first. In the interrogation room with his court-appointed lawyer beside him, Richmond maintained his innocence with the calm certainty of a man who had been practicing the lie for 4 decades. He didn't know Diane Holloway. He had never been to her house. He had no idea what the police were talking about. The detectives laid out the evidence. The DNA match, the genealogical investigation, the coffee cup from the McDonald's parking lot. They explained patiently and thoroughly that there was no possibility of error. 22 genetic markers. A 1 in several billion chance that the semen found on Diane's body belonged to anyone other than Raymond Lee Richmond. Richmond's story changed. Yes, he had known Diane. He remembered her now. A pretty young woman from the neighborhood. Yes, he had been with her on the night of November 5th, 1979. But it was consensual. She had invited him over. They had been having an affair. He had left her alive and well, and someone else must have killed her afterward. The last refuge of a man with no other defense. But the evidence told a different story. Diane Holloway had not consented to anything. The autopsy had documented defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, the marks left when someone fights for their life. There were ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, evidence that she had been restrained. There were bruises on her face and body consistent with a brutal beating. There was the torn blouse, the missing shoe, the clump of hair pulled from her scalp. And there was the location where her body had been dumped, a vacant field 2 miles from her home, hidden under brush and debris. This was not the aftermath of a consensual encounter. This was the calculated disposal of a victim by a man who knew exactly what he had done and was trying to hide it. Raymond Richmond had not been Diane's lover. He had been her killer. And for 4 decades he had lived half a mile from the scene of his crime, watching her mother march past his street and never said a word. The arraignment was held 2 days later. Richmond pleaded not guilty. Bail was denied. He was transported to the Wayne County Jail to await trial. A 78-year-old man in an orange jumpsuit shuffling down a corridor lined with steel doors, finally beginning to understand that the freedom he had enjoyed for 4 decades was never coming back. The wheels of justice turn slowly, even in cases where the evidence is overwhelming. Raymond Richmond's arrest in June 2019 should have led to a trial within a year. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. The genealogical investigation had been meticulous. The case file, though 40 years old, contained detailed documentation of the crime scene, the autopsy findings, and the failed attempts to identify a suspect. Everything pointed to a straightforward prosecution. First-degree murder, life in prison, case closed. But 2020 had other plans. The COVID-19 pandemic shut down courtrooms across Michigan. Trials were postponed indefinitely. Juries couldn't be seated. Witnesses couldn't be deposed. The entire criminal justice system ground to a halt, leaving defendants in limbo and victims' families in agonizing suspense. Pat Ogilvy was 82 years old when the pandemic began. Her health, already fragile, had been declining for years. She walked with a walker now, her spine curved with osteoporosis, her breathing labored from a lifetime of Michigan winters. She had waited 40 years for justice. Now she was being asked to wait longer. She didn't complain. She never complained. She simply added another candle to the shrine on her mantle and continued her vigil. November 6, 2020, the 41st anniversary of Diane's murder, came and went without a trial date. The vigil that year was small, just Pat and a handful of family members standing outside the police station in masks, their candles flickering in the cold. The pandemic had stolen so much from so many people. For Pat, it threatened to steal the one thing she had spent her entire life fighting for. But she refused to give up. She had never given up. "If I die before the trial," she told her family, "you finish this for me. You see it through. Promise me." They promised. The breakthrough came in the fall of 2021. Wayne County courts were slowly reopening, working through a massive backlog of cases that had accumulated during the pandemic. Raymond Richmond's case was assigned to Judge Harold Morrison, a veteran jurist with a reputation for efficiency and fairness. A trial date was set for late November. But Richmond's lawyers had been negotiating. The evidence against their client was insurmountable. The DNA match was beyond dispute. A jury trial would be a formality. 12 citizens listening to the science, looking at the crime scene photos and returning a guilty verdict within hours. The only question was whether Richmond would spend his remaining years fighting a hopeless battle or accept the inevitable. On November 5, 2021, 42 years to the day since Diane Holloway was murdered, Raymond Lee Richmond agreed to plead guilty. The hearing was held in Courtroom 5 of the Wayne County Circuit Court. The gallery was packed. Journalists, victim advocates, officers who had worked the case over the decades. And in the front row, directly behind the prosecutor's table, sat Patricia Ogilvy. She was 83 years old. She wore a dark blue dress, low-heeled shoes she could manage with her walker, and the same small gold cross necklace she had worn to Diane's funeral 42 years earlier. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were clear and steady, fixed on the man who had taken her daughter. Richmond was brought in through a side door. He had aged in the 2 years since his arrest. Hair thinner, skin sallow, posture stooped. He shuffled to the defense table and sat down without looking at the gallery. In all the court appearances, all the hearings, he had never once looked at Pat Ogilvy, as if refusing to see her could make her less real. Today, he would have no choice. The proceedings were brief. The prosecutor read the charges: first-degree murder in the death of Diane Marie Holloway. She recited the facts: the abduction, the rape, the beating, the strangulation. She described the 40-year investigation, the preserved evidence, the DNA match that had finally brought the killer to justice. Her voice was steady, professional, but there was an edge to it. Even prosecutors who had seen everything were moved by this case. Judge Morrison turned to the defendant. "Mr. Richmond, you have agreed to enter a plea of guilty to the charge of first-degree murder. Before I accept this plea, I must ask you, did you kill Diane Holloway?" The courtroom held its breath. Richmond sat motionless for a long moment. His lawyer whispered something in his ear. Finally, in a voice that cracked with age, he spoke. "Yes." One word, 42 years to say it. "On the night of November 5, 1979, did you abduct Diane Holloway from her home, sexually assault her, and strangle her to death?" Another pause, another whispered consultation. "Yes." Pat Ogilvy closed her eyes. Tears ran down the creases of her face. Beside her, Mickey Holloway, 42 years old now, the same age his mother had been denied, put his hand on his grandmother's shoulder and held on. Judge Morrison accepted the plea. He reviewed the sentencing guidelines, though there was only one possible outcome for first-degree murder in Michigan: mandatory life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. No exceptions, no early release, no second chances. "Raymond Lee Richmond," the judge said, "you are hereby sentenced to life in the Michigan Department of Corrections without the possibility of parole. You will die in prison." Richmond stared straight ahead, expressionless. He was 78 years old. He had lived as a free man for 40 years after committing one of the most brutal crimes in E-Course history. Now he would spend whatever time he had left behind bars, forgotten by the world, forced to reckon with what he had done. Pat Ogilvy was allowed to give a victim impact statement. She rose slowly from her seat, gripping the arms of her walker, and made her way to the podium that had been set up for her. The courtroom was silent. Everyone watched the small woman with the white hair and the gold cross necklace, the woman who had spent 43 years fighting for this moment. She stood at the podium for a long moment, gathering herself. Then she looked directly at Raymond Richmond. For the first time in the proceedings, he had to meet her eyes. "You took my daughter," Pat said. Her voice was thin with age, but it carried. "You took her from her baby. You took her from her husband. You took her from me. And then you lived your life as if nothing had happened." She paused, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. "I watched you. Every November 6th, I marched past your street. I held my candle and my sign and my daughter's picture. And you were there, in your house, with your family, pretending to be a good man." Richmond lowered his eyes. "I want you to know something," Pat continued. "I never gave up, not one single day. Every morning I woke up and I thought about Diane. Every night I prayed for justice. For 43 years I refused to let the world forget my little girl." Her voice broke, but she pressed on. "You thought you got away with it. You thought time was on your side, but you were wrong. God gave me enough time to see this day. Enough time to look you in the eye and tell you you don't get to win. Diane wins. Justice wins. And you get to spend the rest of your miserable life in a cage, knowing that an 83-year-old woman beat you." She turned away from him then, dismissing him, erasing him from her sight. She looked at the judge. "I'm done now. Thank you." After the hearing, Pat spoke briefly to reporters in the hallway outside the courtroom. Her family flanked her. Mickey, her other children, grandchildren she had watched grow up while still mourning the daughter who never got that chance. They formed a protective circle around her, but she stood at the center, unbowed. "I lived long enough to see justice for my little girl," she said. "Now I can go be with her." A reporter asked if she had any final words for Raymond Richmond. Pat shook her head slowly. "I've said everything I need to say to him. He doesn't matter anymore. Diane matters. Her memory matters. And today her memory won." She turned and walked away, her walker clicking against the marble floor, her family following close behind. Behind her, the courtroom doors swung shut on the man who had stolen 43 years from her, and who had finally run out of time. Something changed in Pat Ogilvy after the sentencing. The people who knew her best noticed it immediately. The tension that had lived in her shoulders for 4 decades, the coiled readiness of a woman perpetually waiting for a phone call, a breakthrough, a reason to keep fighting, finally began to ease. She moved more slowly now, but it wasn't the slowness of defeat. It was the slowness of someone who had finally set down a burden she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to stand without its weight. In the weeks after Raymond Richmond was led away in shackles, Pat did something she hadn't done in 43 years. She rested. She stopped calling the police department. She stopped clipping newspaper articles about cold cases and DNA breakthroughs. She stopped rehearsing the speech she had always planned to give at the trial that might never come. The trial had come. The speech had been given. The man who murdered her daughter was locked in a cage where he would die, alone and forgotten, while Diane's memory lived on. It was over. Finally, impossibly, it was over. Pat spent the winter of 2021-2022 surrounded by family. Her children visited more often, bringing grandchildren and great-grandchildren who climbed onto her lap and listened to stories about the aunt they had never met. She showed them the photographs, the same ones she had shown Mickey all those years ago. She told them about Diane's laugh, about her love of Motown, about the way she used to dance in the kitchen with a dish towel as a microphone. She told them about the vigils. 41 of them, one for every year since Diane's death. She told them about the letters she had written, the phone calls she had made, the doors she had knocked on when everyone else had given up. She wanted them to understand that justice doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone refuses to accept injustice. It happens because ordinary people do extraordinary things not out of courage but out of love. Patricia Ann Ogilvy passed away on May 12, 2022. She died at home, in the same house where she had raised Diane, where she had built the shrine on the mantle, where she had spent 43 years keeping her daughter's memory alive. Her children were with her. Her grandchildren were there. Mickey, the baby who had cried alone in his crib on the night his mother was taken, held his grandmother's hand as she took her final breaths. She was 83 years old. She had outlived her daughter by more than 4 decades. She had fought a battle that most people would have abandoned after a year, after 5 years, after 10. She had won. The doctors said it was heart failure, but her family knew better. Pat's heart hadn't failed. It had simply completed its work. She had stayed alive long enough to see justice done, and once that mission was accomplished, she had given herself permission to rest. Raymond Lee Richmond remains incarcerated at the Thumb Correctional Facility in Lapeer, Michigan. He is prisoner number 987654, housed in the geriatric unit with other elderly inmates serving out their final years behind bars. He receives no visitors. His family, shattered by the revelation of what he had done, has largely disowned him. His grandchildren, the ones he bounced on his knee while Diane's bones lay cold in the cemetery, no longer speak his name. He will die in that facility. He will never again walk a free street, never again sit in his own living room, never again pretend to be an ordinary man living an ordinary life. The freedom he enjoyed for 40 years, the freedom he stole from Diane Holloway, has been permanently revoked. The man who killed Diane Holloway thought he had won. He lived free for 40 years. He watched her mother march past his street every November. He thought time was on his side. He was wrong. Justice doesn't always come quickly. It doesn't always come easily. But it comes. Sometimes it takes a DNA breakthrough. Sometimes it takes a detective who refuses to close the file. Sometimes it takes a mother who holds a candle every single year for 4 decades, refusing to let the world forget. Rest in peace, Diane. Rest in peace, Pat. Your fight is over. Your story will never be forgotten. If this case moved you, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week. Cold cases solved, families who never gave up, justice delayed but not denied. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. But before you go, there's another case you need to hear. Carol Sue Klaber, 16 years old, voice of an angel, found in a Kentucky drainage ditch in 1976. For 46 years, her killer sat in her church, watched her mother grieve, said nothing, until a coffee cup finally exposed the monster hiding in plain sight. Click the video on your screen now. This one will haunt you.